I only have 45 to 50 minutes to speak to you all, so I'm going to read, otherwise you would get lots of interesting anecdotes about Franciscan history, but it wouldn't necessarily be the material that I want to get with you on the slides. So I'm going to begin by saying something a bit unpopular in this room, that some years ago, after I'd written my first book, The Franciscan Invention of the New World, and a series of articles on Franciscan history, I said to myself, right, that's it, no more Franciscan history. Now, as you can imagine, that didn't turn out to be the case. The deeper I've gone into doing Mexican history and global history, and the more I've done on indigenous histories and histories of environmental knowledge and food sovereignty, the more I've discovered about Franciscan sources and networks and the different things that they can tell us about these themes in particular. So in the last years, I've spent some time with this food sovereignty network, working with indigenous agroecological communities in Chiapas and Oaxaca. With my food sovereignty network, we accompanied the people of the Bienes Comunales of the Selva Lacandona as they developed a new land management plan called the Plan de Vida. So following that project, I went deeper into the history of that region, contributing to a project known as the Global Middle Ages, on a project on zomias, which is James Scott's concept of stateless spaces, with a history of autonomous communities in the Selva Lacandona. Now, interestingly, the earliest colonial source for that region was actually produced by the Franciscan friar Antonio de Ciudad Real, who travelled in southern Mexico and Guatemala in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and described indigenous and agroecological practices there. His writings, I would argue, have been quite overlooked by historians, and yet they offer important insights into indigenous communities in this region. Scholars interested in early colonial history in southern Mexico have often stopped with the more familiar work of Diego de Landa, and yet there are so many more interesting missionary writings from this region. So my point here is just to say that when we're looking to kind of understand and expand our knowledge of indigenous histories and different regions, it's often Franciscan sources that we find that can offer important insights. Oh, and the other thing that I wanted to say is that to begin with, so I'm talking a lot about indigenous history today, and I wanted to begin by acknowledging also that we're meeting on the ancestral territory of the Chumash people. So I won't be talking about the Maya region in southern Mexico today, but instead focusing on the theme of this conference, which is in the footsteps of the 12. And so I'll be considering the places that they went in the valleys of Mexico, Tlaxcala and Puebla. I'll be considering what we can understand about their roles in developing colonial society in the early 16th century, and also how we can broaden our sense of colonial sources and to read new histories of indigenous peoples in the Americas in the 16th century. So I don't know if we've got any Nahuatl experts in the room, so I just want to make a disclaimer that I'm going to say quite a few Nahuatl words. If there's any experts, you can take it up with me later. I'm going to do my best. So 8 years after the publication of my monograph and having followed a range of different research interests, rather than go back and sort of talk again about the themes that were in the Franciscan Invention of the New World book, I wanted to take this opportunity to share some new research, some things that I wish I'd kind of put in the book at the time of writing, and to highlight some of the things that I think of as the new directions that have been emerging in the last years in the very rich field of the history of the Franciscans in the Americas. So I see these strands as increased focus on Indigenous agency, which may be also thinking about how we can go beyond the conceptual frameworks of transcultural syncretism and hybridity. So the focus on Indigenous people has always been central to the history of the Franciscans in the Americas, and one could even argue that the Franciscan Bernardino de Sahagún was the first European to really take seriously Indigenous histories. But every year I think that decolonial methodologies are emerging to help us reconsider how we can use these Franciscan sources and Indigenous histories to retell histories of Indigenous agency, resistance and subversion. I don't know whether this is just one of my particular interests, but I think also increased focus on the natural world, ecological and agroecological knowledge. Also the Franciscans' contribution to the construction of colonial blackness, global networks and complex legacies. Now, although I've been given 45 to 50 minutes, I did run out of space putting together just coherent material for just the first couple of these strands. So if there's time in questions or in the next couple of days that we've got together to chat about some of these things, I hope that there's more chance. Just a note that the sources that you see on the slide there are related to the Franciscan sources produced in the colonial context, and I'll be referring to some of these today. The top one is from a recent series of workshops that I gave on the Codex Cuthbadiana in Oaxaca, so we can also talk more about this. So taking seriously that first strand of increased focus on Indigenous agency, I wanted to begin with an exploration of the history of Indigenous societies prior to the arrival of Europeans. The more I develop my work and think beyond the 16th century, the more that I think that global understandings of the Middle Ages are particularly important. So I'm going to go and highlight a few features of medieval Mesoamerican cosmologies, and these will be relevant for thinking about Indigenous agency in the history of what I'm calling converging cosmologies for the colonial period. So if you think I'm going off tack and not talking enough about the Franciscans, bear with, because it hopefully will become relevant in the second half. So on the eve of European invasion, the Americas were home to approximately 54 million Indigenous people. There were many different cultural, ethnic and linguistic groups with different modes of production and cosmological frameworks for understanding the world. The following chronology and intensity of colonization would vary across the Americas, with some Indigenous groups maintaining autonomy and anti-colonial resistance into the modern era when new phases of resistance began. The Europeans focused their efforts to colonize the mainland of the Americas in the area of Mesoamerica that is today known as the Valley of Mexico, known in Nahuatl, language of the people who lived there, as Anahuac, or place between the waters. It became the focal point of early European colonization, especially since the region was home to the largest geopolitical unit, a tributary empire that later became known by Europeans as the Aztec Empire, a confederacy that had at its capital Tenochtitlan. The geopolitical unit, commonly referred to as the Aztec Empire, was a triple alliance composed of dominant Nahua city-states of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, home to the Mexica, the dominant Nahua group, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. On the eve of European invasion, this was a young empire that was still consolidating its power over the city-states in the surrounding valleys of Puebla and Tlaxcala. This was the period of the Flower War, a political and religious war where those captured in battle could be sacrificed to the gods in petition for rains to overcome drought and famines. Some of these tributary states, such as those of Huecotzingo, had become allies in the 15th century to avoid capture in the ongoing Flower Wars, while others, such as the Tlaxcalans, remained enemies. Mesoamerica was characterized by a ritual landscape. People living in the valleys of Mexico, Tlaxcala and Puebla were dependent upon the water sources in the plains and were surrounded by hills, mountains and volcanoes. Hills and mountains, springs and rivers were often sacred places, dedicated to particular gods and goddesses. The basic political unit was the city-state, known in Nahuatl as Altepetl, derived from atl, meaning water, and tepetl, meaning mountain, indicating the importance of the natural world to the foundations of society. It is thought that the pyramid structure, which dominated the civic religious landscape, represented mountains and the abundance of the reproduction of the earth. The image that you see on the slide here is the pyramid of Teotihuacan, the largest remaining pyramid in northern Mesoamerica. The society of Teotihuacan had declined by the mid-6th century Common Era, and this may be why the pyramid remains. Elsewhere, the Spanish took over indigenous civic religious spaces to establish their authority through the built environment. The bottom image you see on the slide here is the Zocalo, the central square of Mexico City, which had been the capital Tenochtitlan. So the Spanish effectively took off the top of the pyramid and replaced it with the cathedral that is still in Mexico City today. This recycling of religious architecture was a strategy that had been used in the Christian wars against Muslim-controlled territory. So, for example, if any of you are familiar with Seville, the bell tower there is actually the minaret that was a minaret when it was under Muslim rule. So this was part of the visual material process of conversion, but arguably this symbolic attempt at the physical replacement of one set of religious beliefs with another also facilitated the syncretism and hybridity that came to characterize many manifestations of Mesoamerican Catholicism. Indigenous temples mirrored the form of hills and mountains. Natural topographic features and their civic religious replicas and sanctuaries both constituted places and political legal spaces where indigenous elites petitioned the gods and goddesses for the resources that were necessary for life. Around the Valley of Mexico, similar to other parts of Mesoamerica, quotidian actions from warfare to agriculture were coordinated by cosmological frameworks of understanding which linked the celestial and terrestrial worlds. Within these cosmological frameworks, the human, natural, and supernatural worlds were linked. In the Aztec world, like other parts of Mesoamerica, the boundary between the human, natural, and supernatural worlds were permeable. Alfredo Lopez Austin explained that, and I quote, "People forged myths from their daily experiences, and so mythical personages were everywhere, in the cultivated fields, in the jungle or desert, in the ocean, in the immensity of the nocturnal sky, or in the corners of their own houses. Mesoamerican cosmologies were animistic. The natural world could have personhood, and deities could appear within the natural world." We see this animism and importance of the natural world in the Mesoamerican pantheon. For example, there was Tlaloc, also known as Chac in Mayan cosmology, who was the god of rain and lightning. There was also Chalchihuitlique, she of the jade skirt in Nahuatl, goddess of terrestrial waters, including springs, rivers, and lakes, who was also associated with Tlaloc. Chalchihuitlique personified water and was important in purification rituals, including for newborn babies and of sacrifices before death. The Mesoamerican pantheon was connected to fertility and abundance of the earth. For example, there was also Chicomequetl, or seventh serpent, the Aztec goddess of corn and sustenance, associated with both fertility and agricultural abundance. Across different Mesoamerican cosmologies, there were also different stories of the roles played by gods in the cycles of the destruction and creation of the world. The idea of self-sacrifice was important to the numerous creation myths of the Aztec religion. In one, the gods had thrown themselves into a fire to create the sun. In another, Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca created the world of the fifth sun by tearing the body of the earth goddess, Tuatlicuitli, in half. Half their body became the earth and half the sky. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of the wind, then created mankind by going to the underworld, Mictlan, and anointing the bones of the dead with his own blood. So in some versions of this legend, he then sacrificed himself after this creation of mankind. So what I'm highlighting here is that there was an indigenous Mesoamerican tradition of the role of auto-sacrifice and the importance of blood for world creation. The image that you see on the slide here is taken from the Codex Borgia, a pre-invasion codex produced in central Mexico, and it's a scene from the Aztec creation myths depicting the first human sacrifice. In Mesoamerican cosmologies, the mundane and celestial worlds were linked, and their interactions were managed through calendars, which were ordered around seasons and agricultural production. Festivals and rituals were important to keep these solar cycles in motion. It was understood the gods gave life through giving water to the earth, which enabled the crops to grow, but they could also bring devastation, withholding the gift of rain or bringing floods. In the Aztec world, the calendar had 18 20-day periods, which the Spanish called Veintenas. The solar cycle festivals of the Veintenas were organized into the two seasons of the rainy season and dry season. Different Veintenas were dedicated to different gods and had particular ceremonies of giving gifts to the gods in the hopes of giving gifts of rain in return so that there would be crops of maize. Aztec priests, sometimes called Tlamatcatzki, were associated with Tlaloc, and their sacrificial gifts to the gods, which could often be children, were important to ensuring the gifts from the gods in the form of water for ensuring the abundance of the crop cycle, which was known as the milpa, or still is known as the milpa. So as Sylvia Pepistrate explains, and I quote, "Just as Tlaloc Tlamatcatzki, the provider deity, held back all food resources and ensured the survival of human beings, Tlamatcake priests were responsible for the gods' needs and relationship of reciprocity. The rain gods offered water to humankind for agriculture, and they in turn gave them another type of water, sacrificial blood known as Chalchihuitl, or precious water. Within the Aztec religious practices, sacrifice had different meanings, and offerings were made to the gods at different times in the calendar year. In this way, sacrifice played a role in renewal. Offerings to the god could be made as debt payment, given that the sacrifices that the god had made. They were also thought of as nourishment for the earth, and blood was needed like water to nourish the earth. Blood was important symbolism for the cosmological meaning of ritual sacrifice, and in some descriptions of ceremonial sacrifices, the priests caught the sacrificial blood in a bowl, which they then drank. Obsidian was the specially selected material used for sacrificial blades, for heart sacrifice and for auto-sacrifice. Some human sacrifice took place in grand ceremonies, at temples, but individuals also engaged in auto-sacrifice. It had its origins in Aztec cosmology. For example, Quetzalcoatl engaged in ritual bloodletting, cutting his leg with a cactus spike. And this is the image that you see here on the slide, taken from Book 3 of the Florentine Codex. So thank you for bearing with me on this. And now we're going to get to some Franciscans. So around 3,000 miles away, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, on the western edge of Eurasia, from the 4th century, Christianity had come to dominate cosmological understandings of the world and religious practices. But there were also local variations, as well as ongoing struggles to define and redefine orthodox beliefs and practices. The Franciscan order emerged in the 13th century amidst these ongoing struggles to reinterpret Christianity and its meaning for the daily life of its followers. From the 13th century, there are a number of cosmological beliefs emphasized by the Franciscan order that I think took on new significance when the Franciscans came to convert the indigenous people of the Americas to Christianity in the early 16th century. So within the Franciscan tradition, blood was an important symbol of the cosmological meaning of ritual sacrifice and renewal. The order's founder, St. Francis, was said to have received the stigmata, the 5 wounds of Christ, on his own body. The stigmata connected the body of the Franciscans to Christ through corporal suffering and the shedding of blood. The wounds of Christ became the Franciscan symbol, for the signature for many of its visual and material culture as they established their institutions around the world. The instruments used in the torture and sacrifice of Christ, known as the instruments of the Passion, Arma Christi, were also important in this visual landscape. Sacred places were also important within the Franciscan tradition. St. Francis was said to have received the stigmata in Laverna, wonderful place if you get a chance to go, a place located at 1,282 metres above sea level that's become a holy mountain and place of pilgrimage. Penitential pain was important within the Franciscan tradition. The Franciscans had sworn an oath which committed them to a life of penance, which we can also think of as a form of auto-sacrifice through ritual fasting and routinized poverty, which became symbolized through the language of the rope belt. The voluntary subjugation of the body became important to the Franciscan tradition, and penitential pain, even drawing blood in extreme cases, was a reflection on the sacrifice of God, of death, sin, and renewal. Before their arrival in the Americas, the Franciscans were developing a global network, and this contributed to their cultivation of the cult of the Passion. The Franciscans were present in the Middle East from the 13th century and were given the custody of the Holy Land in the 14th century. In the Middle East, the Franciscans cultivated the cult of the Passion based upon different phases of the corporal sufferings of Christ during Holy Week. In Jerusalem, there was an old pilgrimage route, the Via Dolorosa, which the Franciscans developed into the Via Crucis, Way of the Cross. The Franciscans played an important role in the proliferation of penitential confraternities from the 14th and into the 15th and 16th centuries. Many of these confraternities were the daughter institutions of the Franciscan order. And this is one of the times when I thought I was going to change my topic, started working on these confraternities and realized they were all daughter institutions, and I hadn't changed my topic at all. More to say on that. So these penitential confraternities were dedicated to different moments of the cult of the Passion. And they came to play a very important role, as I know people in this room know very well, in Black and Indigenous confraternities in the Americas. Cue the moment you've all been waiting for. In 1524, the Franciscan enterprise in the New World was elevated when the Minister General of the Franciscan Order commissioned the so-called 12 Apostles of Mexico, the important event of this in the history of European colonialism in the Americas that we're reflecting on here in these days. The 12 apostles landed in the port of Veracruz and arrived in the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan. The event was mythologized by one of the 12, Jeronimo Mendieta, who described how the Spanish conquistador, Hernán Cortés, supposedly knelt before the 12 apostles as they arrived and kissed their hands. With a dramatic flourish, he also emphasized the importance of this moment in the conversion of indigenous people, because he said that then the indigenous people followed suit of the example set by Cortés. Cortés then wrote to Charles V, the Habsburg monarch, and requested that a special mandate be given to the Franciscans for their role in the conversion of the Americas. The Franciscans dominated the missionary efforts for the first years of colonization, and they initially focused on the Mexican, Tlaxcalan, and Puebla valleys. There's a famous fresco of the Franciscans' arrival in Mexico in the convent of Huecotzingo. Next to this fresco is a slightly less famous one, focused upon the instruments of the Passion. And this is very much a theme of this convent. Anyone been there? No? A few people. Excellent. I've got questions. So it's about this theme that I'm going to say more about. So the Franciscans established this monastery of San Miguel in Huecotzingo in 1525, making it one of the earliest in the Americas. The monastery of Huecotzingo tells an important story of the early interactions between Franciscans and the indigenous people. The main building is structured like a castle, representing the Temple of Jerusalem in the Middle East. And here the Franciscans chose an architectural style that quoted the Middle East. There are multiple reasons why they may have done this. As is well known, the Franciscans sometimes depicted their conversion of indigenous people as a continuation of the Crusades and the battle against for the conversion of Muslim people. Studies of Franciscan networks also showed the significance of their global connections, their continued involvement with the Middle East and the way that they used the arms they were collecting to rebuild the city of Jerusalem as a holy city, as a Christian city. So there's this kind of direct connection of kind of rebuilding the city of God in Jerusalem and the Americas being kind of directly related to that. I also think it has another symbolic purpose in connecting Huecotzingo, the place of the death and resurrection of Christ, with this conversion process that's going on in Huecotzingo. And this connection to the Christian blood culture, I think, is significant. I'll say more on this. So just to say more about its structure, it was marked by posas, which were open-air chapels, and these chapels were known for open-air conversions, and they were also thought to be similar to the open temple houses, calles, on Aztec pyramids. So this kind of recycling of space we see. The stonework decorations of the monastery contained both Franciscan and Mexican motifs. The posas chapels were decorated with the signature Franciscan rope belts, representing the Franciscans' penitential poverty. The 5 grape clusters represent the stigmata, both of Christ and St. Francis. The use of grapes in the representation of the stigmata alludes, of course, to the Christian belief in transubstantiation, coming from the Last Supper, when Christ turned the wine into blood before he went on to sacrifice his own blood for the salvation of humanity, according to Christian beliefs. The angels on this chapel carry the instruments of the Passion, the symbols of shedding blood in ritual sacrifice. The artists who carved the stonework were indigenous, possibly trained in the Pedro de Gant's Franciscan Missionary School. The stonework also shows the influence of Mexican cultural traditions. In some case, the grapes of the stigmata appear more like maize. This highlights the fusion of cosmologies, and before the arrival of Europeans, indigenous people of the region conceived of ritualized blood sacrifices as a petition to the gods for rain and the abundance of the maize harvest, the milpa. Each of the chapels in Huecotzingo had a cross, and only one of these survives now and is in the monastery courtyard. It's to these that I'll now turn, but just to show you briefly some of the stonework that you can see with this fusion of styles. So the Huecotzingo cross, like other atrial crosses found in the region, tells a story of the syncretic fusion of cosmological understandings of the ritual significance of blood, sacrifice, and penitential pain. In the Christian tradition, the cross was the symbol of the suffering and death and resurrection of Christ. And this became embodied in the Franciscan tradition through the belief in the stigmata of the order's founder and the symbolic association with the instruments of the Passion and wounds of Christ. The notion of the sacrificial spilling of blood for the renewal of life on earth was prominent in indigenous cosmologies and rituals prior to the arrival of Europeans. Crosses were significant in Mesoamerica prior to the emergence of Christianity, also in the tree of life or world tree, which you see in some of the codices. The image that you see here on the slide is from the Codex Borgia, which was produced around the area of Huecotzingo. The atrial crosses were often produced also by indigenous craftsmen and quoted both Christian and local indigenous beliefs. The atrial crosses, and here is where you see the kind of the fusions going on, sometimes included obsidian, which had been used for the sacrificial knives of Aztec sacrifice. In one atrial cross that can be found in Michoacán, the atrial cross contained obsidian within the Franciscan shield of the stigmata, a symbolic fusion of cosmovisions. The convent of Huecotzingo is most famous for a particular set of frescoes, those of the hooded penitential confraternity processions of the Cofradía de la Veracruz, the Confraternity of the True Cross. The Cofradía de la Veracruz of Huecotzingo was founded before the end of the 16th century. Its members were mainly local indigenous people, including nobles, and many of the records of the confraternity are in Nahuatl. By the mid-17th century, it registered its first mention of black members. It was one of a large number of indigenous and black confraternities that developed across Latin America in the late 16th and 17th centuries and were very important for the negotiation of civic status. Symbols of the instruments of the Passion were central to the visual culture of the Cofradía de la Veracruz in Huecotzingo. They were important to the way the Franciscans instructed indigenous communities in the Passion of Christ and its theological meanings, but it also had resonance with pre-existing beliefs about enduring pain, blood and sacrifice, and we can see this in the co-representation of the instruments of the Passion and the obsidian. The image of the hooded penitential processions in Huecotzingo is significant as, according to art historian Susan Webster, it's the first depiction of a hooded confraternity procession, suggesting that this practice may have begun in the Americas and then come to influence penitential processions in Europe. The Franciscan convent in Huecotzingo was over 100 kilometers from the emerging colonial capital in Mexico City, but it was a place of global influence. Not only was it in dialogue with Spain, but also the Philippines, where its retablo style was reproduced. I think there's much more research to be done on sites like Huecotzingo, and suspect that these local parish archives, as I know many people in the room know, have many stories to tell about the agency of indigenous people in the Americas during colonialism, as well as the violence of this colonialism. Unfortunately, when I visited Huecotzingo, it was 2018, the year after the big earthquake, and having gone all that way, I wasn't allowed in, but I creeped over where there's a balcony and took this picture, and I don't know where the reconstruction work is up to, whether they have managed to restore the murals. But yeah, they were sealed off at the time. But just visiting Huecotzingo really gave me new insights into experiencing its material and symbolic landscape, and to understand this phenomenon that I'm describing here as converging cosmovisions of blood, sacrifice and renewal. So after visiting the convent, I walked around Huecotzingo and eventually went to the parish church. Hanging on the wall was this painting. Unfortunately, like many artworks of colonial Mexico, this is without bibliographical detail, but I've consulted an art historian who thinks it's most likely produced by locals in the 17th century. Those who had their hands up for going to Huecotzingo, if you know something about this or know somebody who might, then let's chat after. I think it's a very interesting artwork. It shows the Passion of Christ, his death on the cross, and the Christian beliefs about transubstantiation, where wine is turned into the blood of Christ and drunk in memory of sacrifice. But it also shows the Nahua beliefs. In Aztec sacrifice, it's reported that priests were thought to catch the sacrificial blood in a cup and have drunk it in a ritual act of renewal. In Aztec practices, the sacrificial blood represented the water of Tlaloc, who would give rain to crops to enable life on earth. In Christian belief, wine produced by farmers from the crops of grapes was transformed into the blood of Christ. In Aztec practices, bloodshed would become the rain for the maize crops. In this way, you have links to agriculture and renewal. In the painting, you see that, I don't know if you can see it closely here, but God is participating in this physical agricultural labour, holding the press to make the wine. So I know you kind of bared with me for the first sort of 15 minutes of the talk there, where I was talking about Mesoamerican cosmologies in the pre-colonial period, but I think the more that we can increase our understanding of that, the more that we can read into the visual and material landscape these histories of indigenous agency and resistance, and the continuation of indigenous cosmologies that are important for mediating that ongoing relationship with nature and agriculture. Approximately 30 kilometers away from Huecotzingo, the 12 Franciscan apostles established another important site of conversion. Martin de Valencia, the leader of the Mexican apostles, traveled to Tlaxcala, home of the famous allies of Hernán Cortés, and founded a Franciscan monastery, a complex that became known as the Tlaxcala Cathedral. So it actually kind of changes purpose, but it's dedicated to the Assumption of Mary. We know about the indigenous perspective on the early colonization process in the 16th century and the role of the Franciscans in creating the New World that emerged in the Americas, thanks to an important document, that of the Tlaxcala Codex. The document, as many of you probably know, is part of the Relaciones Geográficas series. The Nahuatl-speaking indigenous laws of Tlaxcala commissioned the mestizo interpreter Diego Muñoz to produce a petition to the Spanish crown for resources in recognition of their role in assisting Hernán Cortés to defeat Moctezuma at Tenochtitlan. It was commissioned by indigenous lords of Tlaxcala as a petition to the Spanish crown for the recognition of their role in invasion. And I'm really excited to be talking to you about it in the time that I've got with you, because the Tlaxcala Codex is in the University of Glasgow in the special collections there. So I was wondering, when I got to Glasgow, how am I going to be working on history of the Spanish Empire, indigenous histories, and then I realized that this is there in the special collections. And there's been some important conservation work going on there to stabilize the manuscript. During that process, we've also kind of taken pictures, preparing a new digital edition that's going to be developed soon, hopefully, Gods of Grants dependent. The image that you see there is from workshops that I do with my students on the Tlaxcala Codex. And because the digitization project is rather new, some of the images that you see now in this next part of the talk, you may not have seen before. So many of the scenes in the Tlaxcala Codex are dedicating to depicting the importance of the Franciscans' role in the conversion of indigenous people. The document presents a very Franciscan story of conversion. I won't read the quote on the slide, but you can see it, and it emphasizes that it was Martin de Valencia, the leader of the 12 apostles, who came to Tlaxcala and who converted the Tlaxcalan lords. In the Tlaxcala Codex, the indigenous lords emphasize that they accepted conversion by the first 12 Franciscans in order to emphasize their special status and their legitimacy and their distinction from other indigenous groups who had resisted the Spanish and conversion. The Tlaxcala Codex emphasized that the Tlaxcalan lords were baptized by the 12 Franciscans. They used their special spiritual status of these Franciscans to elevate their civic status. The font, where the ritual washing of the baptism occurred, became a place of civic religious importance. The Tlaxcalan lords emphasized the Franciscan origins of their Christianity to emphasize their authority and to justify their influence on the colonial landscape, including things like policy advising, such as how the congregations should be organized. The Tlaxcalans, however, were sceptical about the holy poverty of the Franciscans. They described the church, and I have it on the slide here. It has for the inspiration the Assumption of Our Lady, but it is not as adorned as in the quality of this city requires, because of the humility of the order of the Friars of St. Francis, and that in their hands, the Tlaxcalan lords, it could have been a better church, much more sumptuous and rich, but they have obstructed it. I know that they let them do it, that if they let them do it, they would make a preference, because they regret a lot that in other cities of fewer people and less quality, there are churches and monasteries of much more sumptuous and grandeur, but not in their city. So Franciscan poverty not going down so well at this point, it looks like. Highlighting syncretic aspects of colonial conversion may seem to limit the emphasis on colonial violence of the conversion process. The Tlaxcala Codex did not shy away from reporting on the violence of the Franciscans' brutal destruction of indigenous cultures. It lamented this loss and explained that it made it difficult for indigenous people to understand their past. And I quote, "When the first Spanish and monks who came learnt their writings about their idolatries, they had them burnt and destroyed and others buried and hidden, so that all was lost, causing a great need for everybody, because with them we would understand and acquire great secrets about their affairs and antiquities, which time has consumed and put into eternal forgetfulness." So the Tlaxcala Codex shows this violence, and so the next image is more disturbing, so apologies for this. Yes, it contains the famous scene of the Franciscans setting fire to the so-called idolatries and the violent subjugation of bodies. So the violence is kind of an important part of the story that we have to keep in perspective. So the Tlaxcala Codex also described how Franciscans tried to hybridize with indigenous religious spaces as a strategy for conversion. Topography and sun were significant for Mesoamerican cosmologies. The Tlaxcalan Codex described how the location of the Franciscan monastery seemed to recognize this. And I quote, "So that towards the side where the sun rises is built a monastery of religious of the Franciscan order, where 20 friars are continually, who administer the sacraments to the natives, likewise being considered by them leaders of doctrine, which the religious do with much care." So significantly, in the pre-Hispanic period of the Tlaxcala monastery was known as Chalchihuapan, a place for the worship of Chalchihuitlique. The Franciscan dedicated the monastery and church to the approximation of this goddess, which they took to be Mary of the Assumption. Franciscan monastery complexes took over indigenous natural sacred spaces, such as mountains and springs. The Tlaxcala Codex described how the Franciscan monastery had a fountain at its centre of its courtyard, and that the indigenous people had called this Chalchihuatl, which the Codex explained meant water of Chalchihuitlas. Chalchihuitlas meant in their language very precious green stones, the colour of emeralds. The Tlaxcala Codex described the significance of this fountain to indigenous people before colonialism, writing, "In the olden days, the paganism of these natives, this fountain was held in much veneration because they considered it a place of an idol. Thus they brought newborn children here to wash at this fountain, like baptism, although they did not give them names because they said their children that they washed here were purified and cleansed from the misfortunes and bad fates and other disasters. They washed them with shoots of reed grass and willow, and with other branches of fresh trees, green and full of flowers." I think it's therefore significant that this spring, this fountain, became located within the Franciscan convent complex, conceptualized as the new site of civic religious authority. In the Tlaxcala Codex, we're also gaining insights into what meanings of the natural world are potentially being lost through this conversion process on these important sites. So the Tlaxcala Codex also described the way in which the monasteries were physically changing the landscape, the ecology and agriculture of these landscapes of the Americas. So it writes that the religious men then have, at the same northern area, a very big and spacious enclosed garden, planted with many groves of fruit trees from Spain, like walnut trees and some chestnut trees, peach trees and pear trees, quince trees, apple trees, olive trees, and many other varieties of plants, like rose bushes and irises and lilies. All things brought us curiosity of Castile, because in this land there was a lack of them. So many Franciscan sources describe this conversion process as working in the vineyard of the Lord, as a metaphor for the historical conversion process. In the monastery complex, there was also a physical conversion process, changing the landscape, introducing new crops into the Americas, a transformation that would have long-lasting effects. Over a decade after the arrival of the Franciscan apostles, and over 120 miles away from Tlaxcala, the Franciscan enterprise in the Americas developed further with the establishment of the Colegio de Santa Cruz of Tlatelolco. Like many colonial institutions, it was built on top of a site of indigenous significance. It trained the children of indigenous elites, and it can be considered variously as a site of epistemicide, indigenous European dialogues, knowledge learning and knowledge appropriation, or there's multiple interpretations that one could have of this Colegio de Tlatelolco. It's a significant site, and I'm going to explain this point, for the appropriation of indigenous ecological knowledge. So, and this is the final example that I have. We're familiar with the Franciscan College, and especially its kind of famous production, right, the Bernardine de Sahagun's Florentine Codex, which is an essential source for understanding indigenous worlds and indigenous colonial dialogues. However, it's not the only important source to be produced there. There was also the Santa Cruz map, or also known as the Uppsala map, which was produced by indigenous artists in the college. It demonstrated the importance of topographical features to civic religious landscapes and aspects of the continuation of indigenous knowledge of territory in dialogue with the colonial process. The Codex Cruzbadiano, also known as the Little Book of Medicinal Herbs of the Indians, was also produced here, and it's to this source that I now turn. So it was written in Nahuatl in 1552 by Martin de la Cruz, a member of the indigenous nobility, and translated into Latin by Juan Badiano, an indigenous scholar who taught at the Colegio de Tlatelolco. Sadly, the Nahuatl is now lost. Both authors of the Codex Cuthbadiano were indigenous students of the college. The manuscript is a monumental compendium of indigenous American herbal and medicinal knowledge, an important catalogue of Mesoamerican indigenous plants, and the ways that they were used for remedies for the health of indigenous communities. So the Franciscan College was an important site of colonial knowledge production. Indigenous knowledge was also extracted because it was sent for reinterpretation and use in Europe. Both the Florentine Codex and the Codex Cuthbadiano were sent to Europe. The Codex Cuthbadiano has now been returned to Mexico. It was sent from the Vatican Library by Pope John Paul II in 1990, and it's now held at the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. The Codex was commissioned by the Spanish settler Don Francisco de Mendoza and was originally sent as a gift for King Charles V. Mendoza was trying to encourage the Crown to invest in pharmaceutical cultivation and give the Mendoza family the monopoly. After it was sent to Spain, it was then used by King Philip IV's pharmacist, Diego de Cortavia de Sanabria, and it's there's lots of, if you Google it or use any internet search engine, you'll still find multiple ways in which this codex is being used by pharmaceutical industries, which is quite interesting, I think. So the Franciscan College of Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco was an important site for also epistemological resistance. The European stylistic form of plant representation produced by indigenous scholars shows how indigenous people were learning and adapting Western ways of thinking and representation. It also shows continuations of pre-colonial knowledge and modes of writing, but the context in which it was produced and the way it was then used and after it was produced make it possibly one of the earliest sources of colonial biopiracy, I would argue. So this is kind of the opening of the conference, and we're kind of about to start really fruitful discussions, I hope, in the next couple of days. So I didn't want to draw too many conclusions. I hope it was useful to begin here with this exploration of beliefs and practices of cosmovisions of indigenous communities prior to colonialism. For me, this is starting to help me to think beyond the frameworks of transcultural syncretism and hybridity, and to think more about reading aspects of epistemological and ontological resistance in the colonial era that may be written into the visual and material landscapes. It seems to me significant also that the Franciscans too had developed particular beliefs and practices about the importance of blood, sacrifice and penitential pain prior to the arrival in the Americas. And I think that these aspects of Franciscan beliefs created fertile ground for the phenomenon that I described here as the convergence of cosmovisions. This may help us to understand the ways in which indigenous communities found ways to continue beliefs about the relationship between gods and nature, linking water and crops in the colonial period. I think it's also fertile methodological ground for decolonizing relations with the natural world. I ended here with this Colegio de Santa Cruz example as a site of institutionalized epistemic violence. The history of the Codex Cuthbadiano acts as an early example of research extractivism and colonial biopiracy as indigenous knowledge was extracted and sent for reinterpretation in Europe. The manuscript has now been returned, and I think that there's lots more work that can be done to work with Franciscan sources to keep on thinking about how we kind of decolonize knowledge processes and regain new understandings of the natural world. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.